So today we're going to talk about Chapter 1, some of the highlights from Chapter 1 of the Real World textbook, just to give you a foundation for everything that's to come for the rest of the semester. So I thought, of course, it'd be important to start with sociology as a discipline and what it is that sociologists think about the world and just our starting assumptions in terms of the work that we do. Sociology is a science. It's kind of difficult whenever you're studying people, but it very much is what I like to call a people science. And we're mainly interested in the world and society and how that can impact people's behaviors and lives and life outcomes, and looking at that reciprocal relationship between the larger world and individuals that make up those worlds. So I usually like to think about sociology as asking two big questions. So the first is, what do people do? And that's largely the observational component of sociology, just observing, seeing what it is, or hearing what it is that people do. The more sociological question, and I think the far more interesting question, is why do people do what they do? And that's really where sociology comes into play. So not just seeing what they do, but trying to make sense of why it is that not only the world exists the way it does, but why it is that people do the things they do, why they end up with the sorts of lives and outcomes that they do. And one thing to think about, just as in terms of a rhetorical question, is to imagine or to just think about whether people might behave differently in groups than they would individually. Because part of I think at the heart of that is the sociological issue of how it is that your placement in the world can influence your behaviors, and context matters really in terms of a lot of these outcomes. So there's still, at the end of the day, the individual decides what he or she's going to do, but a lot of those choices really are influenced by our placement in those larger social structures that we find ourselves in. So your book defines sociology something along these lines: systematic study of the world. And again, it does stress this broader context of life, like I've been saying, in trying to explain people's behavior. And we're really interested in making sense of people's lives based on their what we call social locations. So those aspects of our identities that might be important to us individually, maybe not, but they do sometimes provide opportunities and or constraints in the larger world. So if we think about sex and gender, there's a way that that's been long embedded in our world, in our institutions. Race and ethnicity, our social class positions, even our aged identities, just a broad, our nation of origin, those sorts of things all matter in terms of how, not just how we're perceived, but how we kind of work our way through the world and navigate all these institutions. So I'll go through this pretty quickly because your book does a good job of explaining the sociological imagination, which is a key idea from C. Wright Mills. And really, when Mills wrote this book, a fellow Texan, by the way, he was really interested in linking people's individual lives to these larger structures. So when he talks about the biography and the history, he's using those terms in slightly different ways than we might be used to using them. Biography is talking really about the individual, so that individual's life outcomes and individual behaviors and just the individual in terms of all those components of his or her day-to-day lives. And then the history component doesn't just mean history in the historical sense, but it's really talking about, and he's really talking about, just the social order of the world in those two dimensions in terms of where you're located and when you're located. So if you think about the United States in 2020, it's a very different world from the United States in 1980 or the 1950s or, the early 1900s. So that time, that temporal component does matter. And then, of course, the geography and just the where component matters as well. So again, if we think about what the U.S. is like or how it's organized in 2020 versus how Mexico might be organized in 2020, or how Europe might be organized in 2020, some similarities, but those things do matter, and there's a difference in institutions and and just culture, which we'll talk about in the coming chapters. And really, C. Wright Mills is interested in how it is that we make sense of those, or at the very least, how we're attentive to both individuals and the world in which we live. That really is the gist of it. He does talk about this difference between troubles versus issues, and really, it's a matter of the almost like the level of analysis. So if you think about private matters, things that we feel are influencing our private individual lives, those would be troubles. Things that are in. They don't necessarily have to be bad things, even though the term is troubles. But a lot of the issues that Mills was considering were negative, I guess. But these are largely described as private matters. So if an individual loses his or her job, or if an individual gets divorced, those would certainly be private matters and private troubles. Issues, on the other hand, are those larger scale troubles. If you think about troubles times, 1,000 or times 100 or, whatever the number might be. But those individual troubles that are more, that are impacting a broader range of people in a particular population, whether that's the United States as a whole, the world as a whole, Texas, Nueces County, whatever that might be. But one of the issues that Mills was attentive to is that a lot of times we feel these issues and these problems as private, and we feel like we're the person that might be alone impacted in terms of those issues. But whenever there's this widespread notion of those troubles, it might be indicative of this larger pattern, or kind of this undercurrent of issues that's making that trouble, or that what seemingly seems like a set of troubles, to actually be a set of social problems. So a couple of examples to just quickly illustrate this would be unemployment. So if one person, or just a smattering of people in an organization or in a community, were fired from their jobs or let go of their jobs, if they found themselves in unemployment, those would probably be private matters or private troubles. However, and I think we can certainly look at things that have happened over the last 3 or so months, if there's this wide scale pattern of a number of people losing their jobs, that is certainly becoming a social problem. So there's millions upon millions of people that are losing their jobs, again, in the US due to COVID. And that's illustrating that it's still a private issue. It's still affecting those people's individual lives, but it's also indicative of this larger issue that's taking place. Marriage, divorce, if we were to look at those issues, same sorts of issues, or same sorts of patterns, I guess we could say. So at the individual level, if someone gets divorced, very much a trouble. But over time, and we'll see this whenever we cover our chapter on the family, we'll see that there's trends, national trends in divorce that are more than just individual choices, but it really is indicative of larger social patterns and outside social forces that are influencing rates of marriage and rates of divorce and what have you. Even credit card debt, your book talks about the example of credit card debt, so I won't talk about it right here, but it's kind of interesting to think about how credit card debt certainly is a private issue and a trouble, but it might also be indicative of a larger social problem or a larger issue. And then I put this last point here: is suicide also a social issue? Just to premise or preface you for Emil Durkheim's study of suicide, which is covered in chapter 1 of your book. But again, also interesting to think about suicide as not just a private trouble, but something that might be influenced by the world in which we're embedded. And there seem to be these demographic trends in terms of rates of suicide attempts and successful suicides and that sort of thing. So interesting to think about it from those two different angles. I'll end here by talking quickly about the 3 big theories that are presented in chapter 1. And the key here is that all of these perspectives are going to be discussed in almost every chapter that we cover from here on out. So whenever we talk about the chapter on race and ethnicity, it'll talk about those issues from a functionalist perspective, from a conflict perspective, and symbolic interactionist perspective. When we talk about work, same thing. When we talk about family, same thing. So it is important for you to get a good handle on these issues from the beginning here. Functionalism, that's a theory, and again, your book does a good job of explaining this, but I'll just kind of extend that a little bit by saying that it's one of the theoretical perspectives that tends to imagine society as a system that's inherently stable, or that strives for this inherent stability, and that stability derives from individuals or institutions and men and women and everyone that's comprised of that in that society to be, essentially fulfilling their task or fulfilling their function. And when that happens, according to functionalists, we're in this state of balance or the state of equilibrium, and that's the goal. Over the years, there's been this critique of this perspective because it can be almost read as a justification for inequality, because part of the way we could read functionalism is that, well, if women are doing what they should be doing, and historically that's been caring for the family, prioritizing caring for the home and not working outside the home for pay. If women are doing that, then we're going to be more in the equilibrium sense of balance in terms of our society. Problems with that, it's kind of a slippery slope in terms of thinking about what the functions are and what the roles and responsibilities are of individuals or groups. Conflict theory picks this up because they're almost the complete antithesis of functionalism, where rather than imagining that the world is inherently stable, quite to the contrary, conflict theorists would suggest that we're all competing for these scarce resources. And those scarce resources might not just be money, but it might also be good jobs, good neighborhoods, longer, healthier lives, etc. The big question that conflict theorists tend to ask is who gets what and why. So who gets the good jobs and why? Who gets to live in nice neighborhoods and why? Who gets longer, healthier lives and why? Those are all conflict-ridden questions. This stems from Karl Marx. We'll talk about more in our chapter on stratification. His focus, of course, was on economic systems. And today, conflict theorists, even though we've used Marx as a starting point, we don't just take social class and work issues into place, but also gender and sex and race and ethnic issues. All that's embedded in conflict theory. And then the last perspective is symbolic interactionism. So I'm going to show you a couple of images here first. This is it looks like maybe five or so men that are kneeling in front of a cross. And then secondly, we have an American flag that's burning in a protest. And here's the Confederate flag. So I'm showing these images to you because this is a good way to think about symbolic interaction. And symbolic interactionists tend to emphasize how we create meaning in our world. And symbols are powerful influences in our world, and they really do organize the way that we see our world, the way that we make sense of our world. So symbolic interactionists would say that meaning is not inherent in particular objects. So again, going back to this image of the cross, a cross really is just two pieces of wood, metal, whatever, that are organized in a particular way. But if you're of the Christian faith, it's a very sacred image to you. A lot of times when we see an American flag burnt in protest, it's just a piece of cloth, quote, just a piece of cloth, but it really is, it stands for more than that. And that's why our blood boils whenever we do see this. Confederate flag, there's been a lot of controversy and a lot of different meanings. Is this a racist symbol, or is this part of our American history, our Southern history? All those things are illustrating how meanings are debatable. Meanings aren't inherent to particular objects, and that's really how symbolic interactionists are making sense of the world. So a quick overview. Hope this helps, and read chapter 1 for more detail. This was just to give you a little bit more insight on some of those ideas.